do work around identifying and overcoming barriers to achieving that. And obviously, we need more and more tools that help people to get to where they're going and to assist with decision makers. And of course, when we've done all that, there's bound to be tons of knowledge gaps, and you need that feedback loop. So adaptive identification of projects, if you like, and feeding into those various areas. There's never enough money to do the work that's required, and you're never going to achieve exactly what we need to know. As we do things, we're bound to be wrong, and we need more science to find out what's going on. So I guess this is where we come into, why am I in this room with you guys this afternoon? And when I went out and did talk to end users, there was a lot of interest around the issue of food security, around the issue of urban expansion and impacts on food security, and again, the linkages of that to human health. So we thought we might do some work around that. We've also had these extreme events, and we've got to make the most of these things. So what can we learn from some of these extreme events? And we would like to do some work around the flooding in Eastern Australia. We had some workshops with various people, decision makers and others, around some of the flooding in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, and thought about some projects that decision makers are really interested in, and we'll be looking at some of those. We've heard in a couple of talks this afternoon the role of using systems approaches to understanding these things. As we get to look at those interlinkages between boxes, we need to use better approaches and start making those more common, and helping end users to actually use those sort of approaches to understanding where we want to go, and looking at where we are and where we need to be aiming at. And there's also quite a lot of interest in conflicts and synergies between human and ecological communities. And again, we've got climate change happening that could mean changing to where we live. We'll encroach into certain areas, and certain natural areas will encroach into where we live, and there's bound to be some sort of conflicts, and trying to get an idea of where that is and what we do about that. Some of the barriers is looking at success factors for adaptation. So where has adaptation been done well, and why did it work? And where has it been done poorly or tried to be done and hasn't worked? And what can we learn from that to help it happen? There's been a lot of interest in just the whole issue of climate change science and decision making, and there's discussions going on in other rooms this afternoon around uncertainty and how we take all this really highfalutin modelling and take it to people who just don't have the capacity. They haven't been taught to deal with those sort of things, and help them to use them, as well as trying to understand those huge issues with uncertainty, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second. And there's also a whole lot of things around social economic factors and climate change adaptation. It's really come out to me this afternoon in some of these presentations. Again, it's a real challenge for us. It's often the poorer communities that are most heavily impacted, and how do those people have the financial capacity often, or the education in many cases, to actually get up and make the changes that are required, and how do we get there? And again, in terms of developing tools, well, we need tools to help people develop and understand how to work with uncertainty. We need to actually get all this information that we're generating through all this work and get it out to people, and so we need to provide resources to end users. So we've got a few projects that we develop around there. We need tools for communication, but I think we also need to understand what the concept of communication is and how we can actually build that, rather than just trying to simplify things down, but actually think about how we can get that transformational change we all talk about. Cost benefits and metrics we've heard talk about as well this afternoon quite often, and again, quite an important thing. And something that's is important is how do we use local knowledge, both in the form of indigenous knowledge and often in terms of long-term landholders, and learn from them how to deal with things. And there was quite a lot of information that came out from the floods in Queensland, where people who lived near people in the Lockyer Valley who had been there for generations actually felt more equipped to deal with the hassles and the pressures that came in those awful few days. And there are lessons that can be sort of pulled out from all that and used pretty wisely. So I thought I'd talk a bit more detail, given that we're talking around here, but 1 minute? I'll babble on quickly around some things that we've talked about in this room this afternoon, and really focusing on that issue of food security, water availability, implications for sustainable and healthy communities, and developing up something around what we might do in this space. And we heard a bit of talk this morning around the interactions between mitigation, policy and adaptation, the potential impact of if we do get a price on carbon and we start to plant trees because we need to take up carbon, and we start to, again, perhaps getting more money for planting the trees than we would for growing food, we might have a loss of certain kinds of foodstuffs in certain areas, and that could have potential implications through to the health and the sustainability of rural communities. And so we need to start to think around those sort of interactions. Things that are important are the peri-urban fringe, the potential loss of some of the important foodstuffs that are grown around those areas, such as the soft leaf vegetables that can't be transported very far. And so those sort of things are actually really nutritious, and so they have implications for the people who use them, and how we can deal with those sort of issues in terms of that peri-urban expansion. Some of the issues that again we've heard talk about this afternoon around urban policy and planning, implications of urban sprawl, changes to housing, greater demand for lifestyle blocks, if you like, rather than actual farming blocks, and the implications to communities there. And again, we thought around, what does 2 degree or 4 degree type of warming mean, global warming mean to rural communities? So again, the implications of those adaptation responses that are required to that warming climate. And that just crosses the whole gamut of things that we've talked about. So again, we need to then pull that all together to get that characterisation of what we need, what a well-adapting Australia would look like. As far as this goes, we've got a board, we've got to deliver this strategy to the board and get it approved by them, hopefully, and then we'll be able to scope out some of these projects more and put them out for open calls. So, when we do, you guys will be firmly in our sights, and we hope that you'll be following what the conditions of strategy and involve those end users and make a difference. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Before we move into the launch, so any clarifications, questions for David?
Is there any consideration for what's happening at the individual level of analysis? One of the end users is the Australian public, but in terms of an individual, a lot of adaptation goes on inside individuals in terms of how they're changing their thinking and understanding. Much research around the world has to do with public risk perceptions, understandings, and responses to climate change at an individual level. And when we do this cross-cutting exercise, almost all of the themes are very structural, very system-oriented. Isn't there a danger that we're going to be using a very important touchstone, what's happening at the individual level in Australian society? And I'm not sure anybody seems to be monitoring that part of the human landscape.
I think it's a very good challenge to throw up, is how we actually get down to making that difference, and that's exactly what we need to do. And how we involve them, I do not know. How we change them, I do not know, and we need to think around that.
So, well, thanks very much, David, and let's thank David again for that very useful. Right, well, in our last few minutes before we move back into plenary, because I think Jean Polutikoff needs us back in the room pretty smartly at about 5:30. So we've got 10 minutes to formally acknowledge the Climate and Health Cluster. I think you've heard a bit about it today in the talks. People have been teasing you with this slide, and there's the banner over there. But I'd like to invite Alan Cairns to say a few words.